Hi everyone, I'm Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So today's video is dedicated to all of my A-level and IB students out there who are studying Othello. So I know that I've done a lot of videos on Macbeth and I understand that a lot of you have been requesting for me to do more Othello content because Macbeth is largely studied by GCSE students. And so I figured that today I'll make a video on some of the top literary critics that you can use for your next Othello essay. So in this video, I've chosen 3 of the top literary critics that I think are probably the best critics out there in terms of Shakespeare studies. And they are Emma Smith from Oxford, Marjorie Garber, and Stephen Greenblatt from Harvard. And so without further ado, we're just going to jump straight into our first critic. And she is Marjorie Garber. And the book that I'll be referencing is called Shakespeare After All, published in 2004. I think it actually won quite a couple of prizes just for being a really accessible and also erudite work on Shakespeare's plays. It's a really accessible work that at the same time contains a wealth of information with lots of great analysis on all of Shakespeare's plays. So I highly recommend that you just pick up a copy of this and read it in your own time. But in terms of her analysis on Othello, I've summarized it for you guys as to what her main argument is in terms of her reading of the play. And so Marjorie Garber argues that Othello's tragedy stems largely from his impulse to deny his private self, and specifically from his desire to transcend his humanity. So Othello is tragic because he tries so hard to not be human. And why does he do that, right? He does that because it's his way of overcompensating for his foreignness, for his blackness in this sea of white Phoenicians. And in doing so, in overcompensating, he becomes hyper self-conscious and ashamed about what are essentially very human traits, such as having sexual desires and strong emotions like rage and jealousy. And Iago, obviously being the wily manipulator on his side, identifies this insecurity in Othello and of course exploits it to his advantage. So according to Garber, Iago is skillful because he's able to achieve his ends without ever actually doing the act, right? So he activates insecurities and vulnerabilities in all the other characters, and as such, he is able to orchestrate and weave together the series of diabolical events, all of which lead to the final catastrophe. So he's an interesting foil to Othello because while Othello tries extremely hard to suppress his human desires, Iago unleashes them and displays them in the most flagrant, blatant, and vulgar ways. So ultimately, Garber's argument is that the root of tragedy in Othello is the character's inability to accept their desires as just a natural part of themselves, but instead their readiness to demonize things like desire as if it were a sin to be removed or judged at. And this is ultimately what leads to the tragedy in Othello. And I've put together a couple of key quotations here for you guys. I will also link this down in the description box below, but for now, let's just take a quick look at what some of her highlights are. And so she says, the play offers us a glimpse of what happens when extremes of reason that deny passion are confronted with extremes of passion that deny reason or logic, right? And so she talks about how Othello may look black, but obviously ultimately the most detrimental kind of blackness is embodied by the white ensign, who is Iago, of course, right? Because he represents moral blackness. On the other hand, the whiteness, which actually is what the word Bianca means, and Bianca, as we know, is the prostitute in the play, and therefore, represents the sort of moral fallenness, but who is truly white in the play, who is truly morally upright and pure, is Desdemona, right? And so we see there's this sort of interesting interplay, wordplay of blackness and whiteness recurring throughout the play, and all of it kind of hinges on these Christian associations of black and white with morality. And then she also says that in proving himself a civilized man who is worthy of the title of a Venetian, Othello has to prove that he is more than a man and that he must compensate for his own ordinary humanity. And so he seems to project this need to be seen as not just human, but superhuman. But of course, as a result, he is driven to uncontrollable and destructive passion because no one can actually be superhuman. So he's setting the bar too high for himself in terms of what he should be projecting to this society that constantly judges him for being different. And then Iago is not only a figure of hatred and resistance, but also a figure of desire, because he desires many things. He doesn't only desire Desdemona in this kind of lustful, base way, but he also desires this sort of diabolical breakdown of human relations. What he desires is for other people to not be able to pursue their desires, right? And as such, he vilifies Othello and Desdemona's desire. Finally, in terms of her reading of Desdemona, Garber says that she articulates passion and desire and she speaks out, but finally to her own cost, right? Because Desdemona is an articulate and ardent woman who intervenes in the traditionally masculine world of politics and policy.
By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature.
And then the next one on the list is Emma Smith's This Is Shakespeare, published in 2019. And personally, I find this to be a super accessible, interesting and engaging read. I know a lot of students, when it comes to Shakespeare, it really is just a slog to get through, especially when it comes to literary criticism on Shakespeare. But trust me when I say that Emma Smith's work is actually really easy to get into. Her allusions, her intertextual references never really makes you feel like you are left out, or that somehow because she makes these intertextual references you don't really understand or follow her main line of argument. So really engaging and a really good overview of Shakespeare's works, and also from obviously a more kind of academic angle as well. So definitely not compromising on academic depth, but at the same time maintaining this engaging and demotic tone. So would really recommend this work. And so in terms of her reading of Othello, her main argument is that Othello is a play in which not just Othello suffers, but all protagonists suffer for their marginalized and isolated positions. And it's not just Othello who is marginalized or isolated as this Black man, but people like Iago, characters like Iago, the ensign, he's also marginalized and isolated as this person who is, at least from his perspective, not really given professional credit or due. With Desdemona, she's also marginalized and isolated because she is obviously this proto-feministic character who stands out in this masculine world where women are supposed to be more supplicant, right, and submissive. But of course, she's not like that. She's very outspoken and she goes after what she wants. So Smith's critical approach is also informed by performance history, and that makes it all the more interesting because she considers how Othello's Moorish identity, especially if it were to be on the 21st century stage, how that would be received, right? For example, in America after 9/11, if there is this association of Moorishness with Islam or the Muslim identity, how would an audience respond to his characterization? If you think about the alternative meanings of Moor as being either African or Black or Muslim, it opens us up to this sort of possible reading. And in terms of her view on Desdemona, she says that it's possible to see Desdemona as the ultimate tragic figure in the play and not really Othello, because despite Othello's foreignness, he is in fact still part of a military community that grants him at least a logic for self-understanding. With Desdemona, she has no true confidant who can understand where she's coming from. Not Emilia, as we see from Act 4 in the play. Even when she tries to confide in Emilia, Emilia doesn't really understand where Desdemona is coming from. You recall she keeps saying that Desdemona is in over her head with the whole thinking about how women should not cheat, right? And Emilia is just like, don't be silly, be a little bit more practical minded. If a man cheats, then a woman should also be entitled to cheat. tit for tat. And Desdemona's like, oh, I can't deal with that, right? I can't rock with that. And so she's isolated and misunderstood, maybe because she's too good, she's too pure, she's, too morally upright. But in any case, she is a woman who defies social expectations in a male-dominated world, largely because of her outspokenness and her willingness to embrace, obviously, an unorthodox relationship and an interracial relationship with the Moor. And a final interesting point that Smith makes is that Othello is a tragedy that's in fact built on the structures of a comedy, because you see a lot of comedic elements in Othello. For example, intricate plotting is a characteristically comedic dramatic element. You have the misunderstood heroine, you have the sycophantic servant, and then of course you also have the handkerchief as the key prop. But in fact, this is anything that's like a dropped item is actually a comic prop, right? As some of you might know from Much Ado About Nothing, there's the dropped letter, right? All of these comedic elements, however, of course, they are reappropriated in Othello for a tragic ending. So what makes it really interesting is that prior to Othello, which was written / performed for the first time in 1603, Shakespeare had been largely writing comedies in the decade ahead of 1603. Perhaps Othello signaled the start of a generically experimental period, right? So Othello isn't just a socially daring play in that it tackles these ideas like racism, marginalization, feminism, etc., but it's also, from a sort of genre perspective, also artistically experimental. And that is what Emma Smith points out, which I think is a great point. He has some key quotations from her. And so she says, in focusing our attention on Iago rather than on Othello at the start of the play, it makes us complicit in the Moor's downfall, because in a way, it gives us right from the start a clear view of Iago's malignity. And so already it, shows us that Iago is this evil character, right? So for the first time when we hear that Othello says, honest Iago, we're already responding to him in this incredulous way, right? Because we're thinking, how could you possibly think that Iago is honest, right? But that's only because the play from the very beginning shows us Iago in what is a very dishonest view, right? So perhaps, this is Emma Smith's way of saying that what perhaps Shakespeare is already implicating us is in what she calls institutional racism through the dramatic architecture. And she says arguments that Othello was more the noble Moor of North Africa were implicitly tied with arguments about his sympathetic character, but arguments that he was recognizable as a black man and Negro tended historically to find him less sympathetic. And of course, there's lots of racial problematics there, given just different periods in history where we had clear issues of racism, right from like the Civil War period, where slavery complicated Black-white relations massively. And then you have in other places like South Africa and apartheid, problems of presenting interracial relationships and miscegenation on stage. That would have been very thorny as well. So yeah, so worth thinking about how Othello would have been performed in different historical periods in different cultures and geographies. And then she says, for some productions, Othello's decline into jealous inarticulacy is figured as a visible turning away from his adopted Christianity, right? And she actually makes this interesting reference to Laurence Olivier's performance of Othello, where at the point when he hears about Desdemona's supposed infidelity, he gets into a rage and he rips this cross from his neck, right? And so this act is symbolic of his perhaps repudiation of Christianity, and immediately it kind of gets us thinking about his perhaps return to what is his more native religion, and that is Islam, right? And this association, subconscious association with Islam, with madness and isolation and murderous rage. So all of these kind of religious connotations that's bound up in the characterization of Othello as a Moor, that's all very interesting. Later she talks about the comic structure that's subterranean in Othello, despite it being a tragedy. And then finally, we have Stephen Greenblatt with his seminal work, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, published a while back in 1980, but I decided to still include his work, despite this being a considerably more advanced and sophisticated work of literary criticism, is because it is just so iconic. I think anyone who studies Shakespeare at a higher level would have to come across Greenblatt at some point. He is probably the most representative critic when it comes to new historicist or even just historicist scholarship in general. So that's obviously a hugely important approach to learning Shakespeare. And again, as a caveat, Renaissance self-fashioning is not for the leisurely reader. Unlike Shakespeare After All by Garber, or This is Shakespeare by Emma Smith, those works you can literally just read for leisure. I mean, even if you weren't studying Shakespeare, you wanted to just understand Shakespeare, get a good overview of what his works are about, a good primer. Those two works, they're pleasant reads. But with Renaissance self-fashioning, it really is a work of scholarship. So I'm going to say, unless you're a Shakespeare buff or unless you are a lit crit nut, yeah, this might be a little bit more difficult to get into. In terms of his main argument about Othello, though, he actually says that Othello falls in the sense of his tragic fall, because Othello creates this false narrative, this untrue story about himself that originates from his anxiety to self-refashion. And really, what is self-refashioning, right? Self-refashioning is just his desire to create this new identity for himself. And of course, he wants to create a new identity for himself because he wants so desperately to be accepted in this foreign society of white Phoenicians, right? Remember, he is a Black soldier in a sea of white Phoenicians, right? So he's constantly trying to project a fabricated identity, but one that ends up being too humanly ambitious. And you can see echoes of this in Garber's argument, this idea that Othello is being way too ambitious, way too morally and humanly and existentially ambitious with how he wants to project himself to the world. But with Greenblatt, though, he thinks that a large part of Othello's desire to self-refashion is motivated by sexual anxiety. And this sexual anxiety is very complicated because it's bound up with a strong consciousness to conform with Christian mores. In Renaissance Venice, Christianity was the predominant religion. And so he was very conscious of the need to conform with the religious doctrines in that society and in his time, because that was essentially his best shot at social assimilation, at being accepted. So that kind of translates into all of the sexual anxiety that spills over when it comes to his relationship with marriage with Desdemona, right, who is this white Phoenician woman. And so even though he is married to Desdemona, it's almost as if Othello sees his marriage with Desdemona as illegitimate, as an adulterous affair to begin with, which is of course irrational, but that is all the spillover effect of his crippling self-consciousness, right? And so as a result of wanting to achieve this kind of religious conformity, Othello is obsessed with notions of sexual purity, even though, and this is the root of the problem, is that this fundamentally conflicts with his and Desdemona's status as a married couple. Because they are a married couple, it's natural for them to want to consummate their love. It's natural for them to partake in sexual consummation, not just as married agents, but as human beings. Is natural to have these carnal desires. But Othello somehow always has it in his head that he must be above having these desires, and that somehow sex in his marriage with Desdemona is something that is sinful. This is, of course, this false narrative that he tells himself, that he must be removed from what are, essentially very human desires and traits. And so ultimately, Greenblatt also argues that Othello's tragedy is that of a man who tells himself and lets himself be told the wrong story about who he needs to be in order to survive in a foreign land. And this wrong story is the one I just said, which is to repudiate any kinds of human desire or accepting the fact that he has these carnal needs. And it all stems from his desire to conform with the Christian doctrine that's predominant in Venetian society. As you can tell from the key quotations here, the language is obviously a lot more opaque than what we just saw of Garber and Smith's works. And so he says, to Othello, the proper sentiments of our Christian husband sit alongside something else, which is a violent oscillation between heaven and hell, a momentary possession of the soul's absolute content, an archaic sense of monumental scale, a dark fear of unknown fate, right? And so really, in essence, what he's saying is that Othello feels that he's not just a husband to Desdemona, but a Christian husband. And so he's constantly racked with these ideas of what is sinful and what is virtuous, constantly sort of thinking about the heaven and the hell dichotomy, and constantly fearing, how he is going to be judged as whether or not he is Christian enough, right? Because he is already not white enough. So surely he must compensate for being Christian enough. That is where all the sexual and moral anxiety kick in. And so for him, quote, sexuality is a menacing voyage to reach a longed for heaven. It is one of the dangers to be passed. And so sexuality for him is not a human experience, but rather a challenge and a danger and a hurdle that he has to overcome. In the second quotation I've pulled out here, he says, Othello's identity depends upon a constant performance of his story, which results in the loss of his own origins and an embrace and perpetual reiteration of the norms of another culture. So this is the tragedy of the foreigner in a foreign land. So in order to feel like he can be accepted, he must constantly reject his own native origins, but to force himself to embrace the religious and cultural and moral norms of another culture, right? And some of these norms he actually misinterprets, misunderstands, right? Because it's not as if white Phoenicians are necessarily so morally and religious upright or conform with them in the first place. Iago is a good case in point, right? He also says Iago's subordination is a kind of protection for him. The fact that he is of a lower rank is good for Iago because it conceals his true power and enables him to play upon the ambivalence of Othello's relation to Christian society. He makes a good comparison between Othello and Iago in that he says, while Iago believes that one can win pity for oneself only by becoming a tale of oneself, and hence by ceasing to be oneself, but to be the story version of oneself, Iago knows that an identity that has been fashioned as a story can easily be unfashioned, refashioned, inscribed anew in a different narrative. So it's very fluid. He's saying that Iago understands that with human identity, it's not just something that you create and remains with you as the static construct, but rather it is constantly in flux. And so it's a story A today, it's story B tomorrow, story C the day after. It's constantly a story, right? It's not static. And so he says that it's the fate of stories to be consumed, or as we say more politely, interpreted, right? So it's interesting because it's almost as if Othello's identity and his struggle with his identity can be seen as a parallel to our reading of Othello as a text, right? So Othello is constantly reading and close reading and interpreting his identity as we, the audience or the reader, is constantly reading and analyzing Othello as a text. And finally, when it comes to Greenblatt's analysis of Desdemona, he makes this interesting point about how the point at which Desdemona declares her passion for Othello, which is actually rather early in the play, that already spells out her doom, because when she says that I did love them more to live with him, that's actually a very blunt and open statement of her, not just her nuptial, but also sexual embrace of them more. This moment of erotic intensity, this frank acceptance of pleasure and submission to her spouse's pleasure is as much as Iago slandered the cause of Desdemona's death. So essentially Greenblatt is saying that this moment when Desdemona says, I love the more, in marital, romantic, and sexual ways, actually that's the point at which Othello is like, oh my God, I can't deal with this. Why? Because it awakens the deep current of sexual anxiety in Othello. And because Othello looks at that and thinks, how can Desdemona, this white Phoenician woman who's so different from me, culturally, sexually, racially, accept me so wholesale? He can't understand it, in fact. And that's the ultimate tragic irony of the play, is that he loves Desdemona and he marries her, but actually he cannot understand how she would be willing to marry him in the first place. Of course, he is sexually attracted to Desdemona, but again, he cannot understand why Desdemona would be sexually attracted to him in the first place. And so it's this constant struggle with this sort of paradox that ultimately leads Othello down this primrose path of uxoricide, of killing his wife, right? Because he cannot stand the fact that Desdemona accepts him. And so that is the ultimate tragedy. Most importantly, though, with all of these great critics and their works, knowing their works and knowing what their views are is not the most important thing. What's most important is that you come back to your own view, your own reading of the play, and to ask yourself these questions that I've spelt out on the slide, which is number one, whether or not you agree or disagree with these critics and why. And most of the time, it's probably more interesting if you find something about their criticism to disagree with, not necessarily disagree disagree in a hostile way, but as in, can you find something about their criticism that you can challenge, right? Or that you can complicate, or that you can say, okay, so he or she looks at it this way, but there's also this part that he or she has left out. And really think about the sort of limitations and the blind spots of their arguments and approaches, because ultimately what's most important is that you consider how your argument stands and where your argument stands in relation to their respective views, and whether or not your view overlaps with theirs or diverges from theirs, and in what ways. Okay, and so I have another video going into detail about how you can use literary criticism when you put together your own essays, and how you can engage with them in a meaningful way, as opposed to just parroting whatever critic A, B, C says. So go ahead and check that out. I will, of course, link that in the description box below. So just remember, literary criticism is here to help us look at the primary text in a more sophisticated way. It's helping us triangulate a debate about a primary text, because what enhances our understanding of literature is in fact our ability to look at it from different perspectives, and literary critics help us do that, and they help give us these different perspectives on the play, and that in a way helps us shed light on how we understand the play and whether or not there are other things about the play that we've missed out on, and to ultimately reach a more meaningful and multi-layered interpretation. As always, if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please do hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel. You can also check out my Othello playlist, which I will also link in the description box below, for all of my analysis of the play. And finally, follow me on Instagram at Hyperbole, where you can DM me with any questions that you may have about your studies of Shakespeare and literature in general. And I will see you guys in the next video. Ciao!